Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, July 1st, 2025. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also president of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times news organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, and we appreciate all you do for the Washington Brief. Today's topic is rising global tensions, a European perspective. How is Europe coping with the growing number of crises on the world stage, both on its own and alongside the U.S. presence? Is there any kind of growing consensus on China's ambitions among the varied perspectives of Europe? The Russia-Ukraine conflict is taking place within Europe. Join leading Italian sinologist today, Francesco Sisci. Dr. Sisci is also going to be our main speaker for today. And we have expert panelists, Dr. Alexandre Mansourov, who's a renowned expert in security and intel. He is also the professor of security studies at Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also adjunct professor of Korean studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. Our moderator today and every program is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Ambassador DeTrani has been a commentator on security issues and formerly the special envoy for the six-party talks with North Korea. He was the director of the National Counterproliferation Center and associate director of national intelligence. Ambassador DeTrani is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is also a contributor to the Washington Times as a columnist with the program that the Times started called Threat Status. Ambassador DeTrani, we're looking forward to this great program with Dr. Francesco Sisci. Dr. Sisci is an Italian sinologist, analyst, and author on politics with over 30 years' experience in China and Asia. He's the founding director of the Appia Institute, a think tank in Rome. He is former senior researcher at Renmin University in Beijing and contributes to several journals and think tanks on geopolitical issues. In 2016, he was granted the first interview with the Holy Father regarding China. He frequently contributes to Il Sole, the Italian financial newspaper of record, and the Asian Times with the column Sinograph. He's a frequent commentator on international affairs for CCTV in Beijing. Ambassador DeTrani, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. We're very fortunate today to have Francesco Sisci with us to hear a European perspective on the global issues affecting the security of all countries. And we'll be going around. We'll be looking for a Middle East perspective, a Latin American perspective, an Asian perspective on these issues. So stay tuned to the Washington Brief, and we'll continue to have these programs. But today we're very fortunate to have Francesco Sisci to talk about some of these issues. And indeed, there's so much to talk about. This past month, whether it was the NATO summit and the commitment of all NATO countries to spend 5% of their GDP on their own security, or the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, President Trump's efforts to bring peace to the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine. What we saw with Rwanda and the Congo, not only a ceasefire, but a peace treaty. And that, I give a lot of credit to President Donald Trump. This is a man who's been seeking peace. So today we're going to unpack some of these issues and hear a European perspective on them. And then Alexander and I will get into a conversation with Francesco Sisci and see where we go from there. So over to you, Francesco Sisci.
First of all, thank you very, very much for this, for having me in this program, which I followed, and the quality of this is for me quite very, very enlightening, and much gratitude. I'm very grateful to Ambassador DeTrani, who has been very gracious to having me, and I'm honored to be in this program. But just to go into the details, I would say, the situation is that in Europe there is now, I feel, after the NATO summit, there is a growing consensus on the issues of defense. After 3 years of war, actually, Europe waded through these 3 years of war in Ukraine and then 2 years of war in the Middle East, as if those wars just partially touched on their security issues. There was minimal, if insignificant, hikes in defense spending, and I would say besides defense, there was no real conscience of that. Now, the recent NATO summits, they all pledged a 5% increase in defense spending. That means that the whole economies of Europe will have to take into account a long-term situation in which war can be a possibility. That doesn't mean that you want to go to war, but that you have to take into account the possibility of war, something that Europe had forgotten for, I would say, 3 decades. And on top of that, you have now what is a setback. Let's not call it in a conservative way, a setback, a major setback by Iran. Iran has been de facto defeated by Israel and by the United States. Its nuclear program has been set back for, we don't know, years, decades, but definitely the influence, the overall influence of Iran in the Middle East through its proxies, through its threats, has decreased. So we are going to see a new shape of the Middle East, of course, where Iran is not so influential. It doesn't have Syria. It doesn't have the Hezbollah. The Houthi has in Yemen have been crippled. Hamas, whatever happens with Gaza, Hamas has been decapitated. So you will see a new political geography of the Middle East where, in one way or another, Europe has to take a place. But here, what I see as a major problem is that, in a way, the United States forgot about Europe. Now, historically, and I won't go into 80 years of history, but Europe developed with the push and with the help of the United States. De facto, the United States invented Europe after World War II and at the end of the Cold War, where the Union expanded east to reach the border of Russia. However, in the past few years, I would say, we didn't have enough coordination between Europe and the United States. And I would say there is not enough political coordination, not enough American leadership in Europe. Of course, Europe is independent, is different, but is extremely important for the global peace, for the global stability. And now China is rising. China is a massive challenge. And I would say that Europe and America need more coordination on China. And without this coordination, well, you know, China being China, it will try to get between, to drive a wedge between Europe and China. And this could increase tensions, short-term, long-term, medium-term. To avoid increasing tension, to try to craft a global environment for peace, I would say Europe as a whole, including the UK and United States, need more coordination and need more coordination with the allies like Japan, like Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and maybe in the future India and other countries. Why? Because with this coordination, this could help bringing in China. And this is the last issue that I would like to throw it to you. Is United States a global system or just a country? Of course, it is a country, I would say, but it's also a global system. And now the two need one another. Of course, the issues of the United States have to be set in order for the global system to work. But also, the United States doesn't have to forget it is a global system. It is a way of life for every country, including China. So if the United States forgets and sets aside the fact that it is a global system, other countries may try to take advantage of it, drive a wedge between the United States and its allies. At the end of the day, the United States will have problems with its allies, one way or another, just like Washington has problems, I would say, with California. But this is not enough to say, well, let's get rid of California. Let's break California out of the Union. So I would argue, yes, I'm sure the United States has a lot of problems with the, with the European Union. The European Union can be a headache most of the time, but is a major asset for stability of the world, and I would say for stability and security of the United States as well. So the two things, I would say, have to be balanced. Mr. Trump, President Trump, managed to score a victory in Iran, managed to bring Europe together on defense. These are major achievements. It's only 4 months, but there is a lot more to go, I would say.
Well, Francesco, there's so much to unpack. Thank you for those insightful comments and commentary. I can't think of anyone who knows China better than Francesco Sisci. Lived there many years, knows the country so well, but also knows global issues, and just this past few minutes articulated them and spoke about the U.S. as a global system, and how we should not forget Europe and the impact of the Israeli victory over Iran and the U.S. participation, whether it was the bombing of Natanz and Isfahan and Fodor. Very powerful. Francesco, let me look to Alexander, but I will come back to what you said about NATO and defense spending and how the U.S. needs to recognize that we are a global system and that U.S. leadership is so important. And I think we're seeing that with President Donald Trump and his efforts to bring peace to all these global issues. So I will look to my colleague, Alexandre Mansourov. Over to you, Alexander.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you, Francesca, for your amazing presentation, kind of description of all the various crises and challenges which confront us today. And of course, as you mentioned, the United States appears to be on the winning side of history as of this moment, with our president, as you suggested, having scored 2 major victories in recent months. One by being able to bring to the negotiation table India and Pakistan and settling that war, and of course lately by being able to find a solution to the Iranian problem by, as you suggested, scoring a major victory in that conflict. It's interesting how you, what caught my attention is the way you described the transatlantic relationship, the relationship between the United States and its allies in Europe. And that is, you compared it to relations between Washington and California. And so if there are any issues there, you know, doesn't mean that Californians should be asked to leave the Union. It can be sorted out in the family. Now, of course, President Trump looks across the northern border, and that's how he approaches all the issues with Canada, kind of viewing it often as the 51st state. So I'm just wondering, you know, whether you suggest that we should here in America regard Europe as the 52nd, I don't know, 53rd and 4th and 5th states of the American system. I mean, the term you coined, the American system. America is not just a country, but it's a global system, and so Europe needs that leadership from the United States to stay united, to stay safe. And we just saw an example of that American leadership at NATO summit when President Trump issued that call for the NATO member states to increase their defense spending to 5%. And most of them answered that call, and NATO agreed to do that. Now, I have questions about that, what happened at that NATO summit and afterwards. And let me start by still Europe is facing with two major wars, one in Ukraine and another, which seems to be over at the moment. But, you know, the question I have is really, is the Iran-Israeli war over, or is it just the beginning of a protracted military engagement? You know, the conflict has been lasting for decades, as you know. And yes, in the latest battle, the Israelis surprised everyone with the shock and awe operations in the skies of Iran and the desert of Iran. They wiped out Iranian air defenses. You know, we haven't seen Iranian Air Force in action, whether it's hiding or whether it was destroyed. I mean, they decapitated the Iranian military and diplomatic leadership. And we claim that, you know, some of the Iranian nuclear facilities had been destroyed. But, I mean, have we seen just the beginning of maybe a decade-long, or maybe 2 or 3 years long effort to kind of instigate, not only to eliminate the nuclear and missile programs of Iran, which were the stated objectives, but also to instigate the regime change from within, so that at the end of the day, not only, you know, Iran's influence in the Middle East would decline, as you suggested, and it's been declining for a couple of years already with the destruction of Hezbollah and Hamas, and you know, the departure of Iran from Syria, and the severance of the link with the Houthis in Yemen. But I mean, some people wonder whether Iran now is doomed to go down that path of Iraq. Remember, in the 90s, we began the bombing campaign to eliminate its, get access and then eliminate its nuclear weapons program, which proved to be non-existent. And then we ended up with a full-scale invasion and occupation and a 20-year morass there. So with Iran, I mean, we know what political leadership says, that no, that's not the plan and all that, and you wouldn't expect them to say anything else. And yet we're increasing dramatically our defense spending. Our allies are doing the same. And again, we hear what the Iranians are saying, that this is not the end of the story. This is just the beginning of a new chapter in the national development. So my question to you is simple. I mean, is this war over, in your opinion, or is it just the beginning of a very long and painful kind of military conflict? On the one hand, and on the other hand, if you can comment on the lessons which other powers, especially nuclear powers, like North Korea and some nuclear wannabes, could learn from the Israeli and American strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. Essentially, you have two nuclear weapon states attacking NPT member state whose nuclear facilities were covered by the safeguards agreements, by the all sorts of protections under the international law. I mean, international inspectors had full access to their facilities. I mean, they signed the joint comprehensive plan of action with the interested parties a few years ago, which was again abandoned not by Iran but by some other parties. And then, despite abiding by all the international obligations, just because the enemy decided that it was not good enough, I mean, they suffered these blows. And by the way, the Western countries seem to have kind of accepted that it's okay, you know. So what are the lessons other states might learn from what we just saw happen in Iran, if you could, please?
Yes, I would start from the broader perspective. What you said, is the war over, or is a long-term conflict just started? Of course, we don't know, but I would say that you have to take into account the possibility that the conflict, the friction will last long. And this is why I would argue that you need more American leadership for Europe, and you need a stronger European Union. You need the gravitas, you need the mass to weigh in the Middle East, not to leave Israel or Turkey, which is a NATO ally, alone. I know that in the United States, some people think that the EU is too cumbersome and too difficult to manage. I would say that EU is very important for transatlantic relationship, and also for the allies, the broader allies' goals and stability. So the EU should play, I think, a greater role with the American leadership, because the EU by itself has, you know, let's face it, not real have any show leadership in the Middle East, just to prevent and say to create a framework, a broader framework for this friction that we are possibly going to face in the next few years. As a short term, I would say that the most significant element, the most significant thing that I found in this war is the position of China. China, as we know, has good relationship. I wouldn't call it an ally of Iran, but good relationship with Iran. But this time, unlike with Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, with Gaza and the support of the Palestinian cause, China this time has been cautious, didn't officially, openly have any rhetorical support, massive rhetorical support, as it happened in the past two wars. This, I would say, is very significant. That means that maybe something is shifting in Beijing. Maybe there is some rethinking about the international position of China. and this could spill over also to Russia and its war in Ukraine. Here in Russia, allow me a little detour, China is caught between Scylla and Charybdis, as we could say in Italian. That is, if you keep on supporting Russia and make money out of Russia, this would medium and long term really damage bilateral relations, because the Russians who suffer a lot through the war, they are shedding a lot of blood because of that. Then they see the Chinese profiting from the war. This is not going to go down well with the common people of Russia. If China doesn't profit, it helps, but without any advantage, the war will bleed China. So it won't be good for China. So in a way, China is in the war, is caught in a war which cannot guide, which cannot drive, it just follows Moscow, and it is between two hard places. So maybe after the issue of Iran, we could see some rethinking in Beijing about the war in Ukraine, and this could give extra pressure to President Vladimir Putin, which has a weakened ally, I would say, in Iran, and maybe a more hesitant ally with China. So maybe in the next 6-12 months, we could see some developments in Russia too, and in Ukraine too. This could have in turn an impact on developments in the Middle East and Iran. Iran, say in 6 to 12 months, 18 months, could have to face the reality that the regime of Khamenei doesn't work. The guy, after all, is 86 years old now. Next year he will be 87, very frail, has failed massively here. So the same Ayatollahs may think of replacing him. This doesn't mean a regime change, but just a replacement of Khamenei, I would say, is not impossible. And this again will move the wheels of change in the Middle East, and therefore you need a stronger Europe, a stronger Turkey, a stronger Israel, but I would say a very strong American leadership to follow and possibly guide, nudge these changes which are set in motion and that could happen over the next 6 to 18 months. I would say this is the broader picture I see. If this happens, of course, North Korea could have time to rethink about its nuclear program and about its destiny, because they bet very big on Russia, on their support with Russia, and on their nuclear program. But if Russia is going to have a weaker position in the next few months, this could be reasons, give reasons to North Korea to rethink its nuclear program, and also I would say its international standing. And then China. So if this strange domino effect will be set in motion, it is moving, we don't know how fast it's moving, but we know it is moving, and it could stop, of course, but there is movement here. And China, we see clearly it's moving as well. There is a shift in its position. Then I would say it is very interesting what China could do or could think in the next a year or two, and this could set the stage for even bigger changes, of course.
So Francesco, so let me jump into this conversation. Thank you for the excellent responses to Alexander's outstanding questions. Let me go back to Iran. You mentioned Iran. In your opening comments, we saw what happened to their nuclear program, Isfahan and Natanz and Fordow. You talked about Khomeini and the and the defeat. They suffered significant defeat and so forth. I want to go back to the JCPOA in 2015, and I know there was a little tension there between our European allies and China because President Donald Trump at that time decided to pull out of the JCPOA. As it turned out, the reasons why were pretty obvious. Sunset clause, that in 15 years, Iran could be reprocessing or could be, if you will, enriching uranium and building enough of or producing enough fissile material for nuclear weapons. So I think there was a lot of opposition to the sunset clause, to the element of a lot of skepticism about transformation of Iran's behavior with their missile programs, et cetera. So a little tension there. I had a sense, because I was involved at that time, because of my work with the National Counterproliferation Center, a sense of little tension with Europe saying, why did the US pull out of the JCPOA? We had some, and we hear some of that criticism now. So my first question is this on the JCPOA, and it turns out most recently, based on the IAEA reports, Iran was moving forward with their programs and enriching to 60% purity level. They were a threshold nuclear weapon state, and their philosophy is very simple. It's destroy Israel, destroy the United States. I mean, if I'm sitting in Tel Aviv and a country is on the cusp of having nuclear weapons and their objective is to destroy us, I don't think I'd be too comfortable with them being a threshold nuclear weapon state. That's my first question. Is there still tension with Europe on Iran? Do the Europeans feel that we've been too dogmatic on Iran, expecting too much of Iran? Because as Alexander said, they were in compliance with a number of the IAEA protocols and so forth. And inspectors were there getting into certainly Natanz and Isfahan, maybe slightly into Fordow. But that's question one. And question two is this. You mentioned the wedge between China, between China and certainly for the United States, looking for China to put a wedge between the United States and the European Union, if you will, NATO, the European Union, and so forth. Where is Europe on that? I mean, China is a major trading partner with the European nations and so forth. How do the Europeans view U.S. relations with China? That, most recently, President Trump talked about a 145% tariff on Chinese products. That's come down, obviously, significantly. But how does the European view our relations with China? Do they feel the U.S. is being too demanding of China? Or are they concerned about what China is doing in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, their intimidation of Taiwan? Where is Europe on these issues?
Thank you, Ambassador. I think this is really the crux of the matter. And to try to respond to these challenges, I would take a step back. That is, Europe developed as such, and in its transatlantic relationship with the United States, based on long-term strategic approaches. That is, during the Cold War and after the Cold War. During the Cold War, for obvious reason, because the challenge was the Soviet bloc. after the Cold War, because many Europeans thought that despite the end of the communist regime, Russia was still, and it's proved to be true, a threat to many other countries and to Europe itself. So there was a broad, general, strategic assumption that guided both Europe and the United States in its approach to Russia. However, with the Middle East, and I would say even more so with China, there is no long-term common understanding of what the challenge is. Is China the challenge only because of tariffs? Only because of trade? Well, if it is only because of trade, why do you give me tariffs and you give tariffs to China as well? I mean, yes, tariffs with China are bigger, my tariffs are smaller, but at the end of the day, you treat us equally, as if we were on the same playing field. And the same with Iran. We think, okay, Iran at the end of the day is not so bad. Other Middle Eastern countries could be worse than that. What is our long-term interest, our long-term framework with the Middle East? Are we totally aligned with Israel or not totally aligned with Israel? What is our relationship with Turkey? All these large questions are left unanswered. Of course, you cannot just have answers just between the two of us drawing on a piece of paper and giving it away. There must be a broad consensus on long-term objectives, on long-term goals. Globally, I would say starting from China, because everything starts from China, and then drawing back to the Middle East. So technically, if I were to suggest something, there should be a center for coordination on China, on Asia, between Europe and the United States, to have some kind of long-term picture. Because once you have a long-term picture of what the challenge is and what your objective is, then you can draw back and you can fix the day-to-day friction and disagreements. But if you don't have a long-term objective, then you can get bogged down in every disagreement you have every single day, and you don't move from there because you don't have a bigger framework to work with. So I would say this is essential and strategic to try to move forward bilateral relations, and also it would be a very strong signal to China, because if you set up this kind of center, then there is less room to drive a wedge. And if there is less room to drive a wedge, then China may be more inclined to come to terms with the American system, not just with the American state, with the American system. So it could be a strategic approach, not just. And then on the single issues on Iran and its nuclear program, again, I would say it is a matter of defining what should be, I would say, the Middle East, what we want in the Middle East. It doesn't mean that we want regime change. We saw that democracy is not just a little plant that can be transplanted in any kind of ground. We know that basil from Italy cannot be transplanted in the North Pole, because the weather is not the same. But at least some kind of general agreement that we don't want, say, for instance, nuclear power in the Middle East, no matter who. We know, of course, of Israel, but this is kind of existential issue. And we have already strategically discounted it. But short of Israel, we don't want any other power to have nuclear weapons, because it would be existential for everybody. I would say not just for Israel. And and I would say the other important issue, and sometimes we played so much with Western hubris, which we thought we could do on our own without thinking of reality. The issue of Iraq and presumed weapons of mass destruction is a powerful lesson. We made a mistake saying and claiming that there were weapons of mass destruction that proved to be a claim that proved to be wrong, and we waged a war that wanted democracy in the Middle East that failed miserably. So I think President Trump is right saying we don't want regime change. But we don't want regime change doesn't mean that we don't want a big security framework that must be shared by all allies, NATO and Israel and Europe as much, for the security of the Middle East. This would give security also to these countries and could send a powerful message to China that it needs to come to terms with the American system. Without that, everything will be more difficult, and the United States will be bogged down in, dealing with this or that instance, and it would be just time-consuming, nerve-wracking, and gets.
Yes,
and in the end,
yes.
it will be.
Please, Alexander.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Of course, we're talking to someone from Europe here, so I'm very curious about what you think about some statements made by your big neighbor. Germany is going through a lot these days. I mean, they're suffering from major economic crisis as a result of the disruption of the Eastern trade and loss of cheap energy resources and an influx of immigration, etc. I mean, they just went through a major political crisis. They have a new government, and the new chancellor is making waves with his statements. And the latest statement he made was about the nuclear weapons, that now maybe it's time for Germany to consider the acquisition of nuclear weapons. I mean, he didn't say that directly, but he alluded to it, and he even proposed different ways to do it, including expanding nuclear sharing so that various European states could kind of on a rotational basis have nuclear control over the nuclear weapons. I mean, is he crazy? I mean, should we take him seriously? And this is coming from Germany's chancellor, and of course it's all justified by the big Russian threat, which, by the way, during the Soviet times was not a good enough reason for Germany to have nuclear weapons as you know it. And so when I ask you a question about the lessons from American-Israeli strikes on the Iranian nuclear program, not only I had North Korea in mind, but I also had other countries which nuclear weapon states which may be concerned about the other nuclear wannabes like Germany. So if they were to follow Israeli-American example, then that would mean a preemptive strike against Germany and against its aimed at its nuclear ambitions. And that would, of course, as you know, lead to the Third World War very quickly because of Article 5 and a lot of other things. and that's exactly what President Trump is trying to avoid. Again, and given the history of German relationship, with Russia, with the United States, with other European countries, I mean, how responsible or irresponsible do you think statements like this? I mean, should we take them seriously? These statements indicating the intentions of Germany to go nuclear down that path. And if that's the case, I mean, if you think it's a good idea, do you think the United States should support it, or should it basically maintain the nuclear proliferation regime, the integrity of the nuclear proliferation treaty, and do something about nixing those ambitions in the bud?
Let's start from an assumption that is, I'm against more nuclear powers in Europe. We already have the UK, we have France, we have the United States with the bases there. We don't need a fourth or the fifth. There is just plenty. There is just plenty. And I think what Chancellor Merz was mentioning is that, and this could be useful, and this actually is something that in the United States and the transatlantic relationship we should think about it, is how to put it, sharing nuclear responsibilities in the EU. Because France is a nuclear power, but now it is the only country which has the power of its nuclear arsenals, and maybe this responsibility should be shared with some other countries. And in this sense, the presence, the responsibility of Germany would make sense. That is not Germany producing nuclear missiles, but being in a shared responsibility agreement. Technically, I wouldn't know how to do it, but possibly this is what they are trying to talk with France within NATO. And as for the danger of Germany developing its nuclear weapons, I'm quite skeptical. Why? Because now Germany has dismantled its peaceful nuclear power plants. Now it's a problem because of energy shortage. They should restart these nuclear power plants. They don't have nuclear power plants. So the danger of having enrichment programs for nuclear power, I think it's very, very far-fetched. Having said that, there is an element of truth in what? In theory, 5% or no 5%, the army in Europe, the European army is immense, is huge. 700,000 people. However, it's very inefficient. Many different kinds of weapons, many different kinds of armament systems, different command structures, different competing intelligence systems. Now, intelligence system, this is very delicate and you want a political reference, but this is just to say that even within NATO, there is no coordination, no real army. And for 3 years, the Russians have been rebuilding their army, have been rebuilding their industrial system, military industrial systems. Europe is zero. We have, I think, I did some consulting for Mr. Draghi in his report to the EU on the competition on the defense system, and I found out that Europe has 3-4 times as many 3-star generals as the United States, with roughly the same number of soldiers. That is, it doesn't work. So I would say Europe, with the help of the United States, with the support of the United States, it needs to rearrange its system, its defense system, because otherwise it doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. Say the Italian Navy. The Italian Navy has wonderful ships, has wonderful shipyards, but do they shoot? Are they ready to shoot? Are they ready to deploy and be effective in, say, the South China Sea? No, they're not. So I would say on top of the 5% spending, Europe needs to re-engage its whole defense system to make it more efficient, more reliable, and therefore really effective in the eventuality of employment. And even the eventuality of employment that, of course, casts a different shade for whatever adversary you have. Now, maybe Merz, I'm not in his mind, maybe Merz and his statements go in this direction. That is, he wants a more efficient, a more effective European defense system. If that is the case, I would say this is most welcome. Politicians change their mind quite often, it happens. It doesn't matter, I would say. What is more important is we need to follow through whatever changes, and therefore I would say as a European we need more, not less, American leadership helping the European Union getting together within the Union and in its transatlantic relationship. If the United States fails in this, as it happened in other times in European history, European countries can run amok. And then,
so Francesco, let me just jump in here on that point. Very good points, Francesco. I think there is a sentiment in the United States, and I think our European allies see this, that the U.S. has been there for Europe. I mean, you mentioned the Second World War. We were there, the Marshall Plan, and et cetera. And the United States has been there for Europe. But I think what we hear with President Donald Trump is, has Europe done enough? And you just spoke to that issue. Has Europe done enough to defend themselves, to be self-reliant on national security issues? And I think the sense was, and based on what you just said, the sense was, and I think is, the Europeans haven't done enough. 5% of GDP, if you still have some countries, outliers, maybe Spain and others, who are saying, well, we can't spend 5% of GDP on national defense. And then for the American electorate, for the American public, we're saying, well, we need to be there for Europe. We extended nuclear deterrence commitments and so forth, looking at the war in Ukraine and what have you. But the Europeans need to take more of an active role, and I think that's what you're saying with the U.S. leadership. But I really think that there's a sense here in the United States that we can be more of a leader, or we are more of a leader. And I think we see this with President Donald Trump. We're trying to rectify some of these conflicts, like in Ukraine and in Gaza, and most recently in Iran. But the Europeans need to be there. So my first question, and then I'll go to my second one. First question is NATO there? 32 nations. The sense was when President Donald Trump came into office for the second time that maybe the U.S. was being too pushy. We were sort of trying to be, I think I've heard even the terms being bullies and so forth. Well, I think that's moderated significantly, and there's an appreciation for Donald Trump and what he's trying to do. So I think the Europeans have changed some of their views on how the U.S. is responding to events in Ukraine and in Europe. So that's number one. Is NATO with the U.S.? Is NATO sort of saying, we'll take a lot of the responsibilities, we're allies, Article 5, you're there, you're committed, and so forth. And is this going to be a joint effort? It's not just relying on the U.S. to be the global peaceman. That's not going to happen, because there are a lot of Americans who feel we have our own issues and we have to manage those issues. That's number one on NATO. But you mentioned North Korea a little while ago in response to Alexander's question. North Korea. Well, North Korea now has aligned itself with the Russian Federation. Mutual Defense Treaty, troops in Kursk and artillery shells, etc., to the Russian Federation for its war in Ukraine. There's some sense out there that China's not been too sanguine, not too happy with this close relationship between North Korea and the Russian Federation. How do the Europeans see that relationship? And number two on that same question would be, Kim Jong-un may sort of say a relationship with the United States, normalization with the United States, is the way to go for global international credibility, for foreign direct loans, etc. What do the Europeans see as the likelihood that North Korea will come back to the fold, if you will, the terminology I'm using, come back to the fold and seek a normal relationship with the United States, but on their terms as a nuclear weapon state? Do you think China would be comfortable with North Korea retaining nuclear weapons and normalizing relations with the United States?
I would go first. I think, Joe, you're pointing again the crucial issue, which is what kind of, if I can rephrase it, what kind of leadership should the United States have with Europe? That is, say in the case of war in Yugoslavia, and say in the case of Libya, United States replaced a NATO effort, a European effort. And I think that, in retrospect, was wrong. I mean, United States could have lent its blessings, but if the European Union wanted to resolve the Yugoslavia issue, it should have solved on its own. Not just to go back to a history which is over 30 years old, but just to say that NATO needs to get its act together politically, and it needs to reorganize itself and reaffirm its deterrence with the United States, but on its own, not just being reliant and piggybacking on the United States, because that doesn't work. It may work in the short term, but in the long term, medium term, it ruins relationship, both because you start a complaint game, it's your fault, you didn't pay enough, you didn't do enough. It cannot work. I think it's right that President Trump, in all fairness, also for other presidents, President Biden, stressed this issue, that is the NATO and European Union have to get their act together. Here there is a need for an American leadership, but European countries need to get their act together on their own, not to be just reliant on money, industry, and support from the United States, because this is, as we are seeing, spoils the system. And then China. The fact that Europe has not been thinking about its defense and the long-term issues of deterrence, it brought the reality that Europe has no China policy. Yes, they are concerned about this trade or maybe this human rights violation. But China is much more than that. It's more complex than that. There is a strategic element, there is a political element, there are many other elements. It's not just a matter of importing EVs or not importing EVs and what should be the tariff on EVs. And here Europe doesn't have an idea. Not even each country on its own has an idea, let alone a complex idea altogether or an idea with the United States. I think this is something that has to be broached as soon as possible, because once you have a framework, a clear framework of a strategic mindset between Europe and the United States and some of the allies like Japan or South Korea, this could give a different spin to relationship between with China, but also a different spin on relationship within the European Union, because the European Union may say at the end of the day, okay, Iran is no longer a threat, so why do I need my weapons? Or next year there will be a peace treaty with Russia. Okay, now I can import more gas from Russia, so I don't need my weapons anymore, so I can save money on there. But that would be wrong, because there are always challenges in the world, and you have to be able to cope on your own, in coordination with the United States, but not just piggybacking and but just being a vampire of the United States, and I say it as a European. And also because China needs to see that it is not facing just America as a country, but a global system. And China wants to be in this global system, but this global system has some rules to work. Otherwise, the whole system will be disrupted and everybody will suffer from this disruption, including China, starting with China, which has been the single largest beneficiary of this change in the past 30 years.
So Francesco, I'm going to interrupt you.
Yes.
I'll give you one more minute to talk about North Korea and China. My question to you was, would China be comfortable with normalization of the US and the DPRK, North Korea? And two, would China be comfortable with North Korea retaining its nuclear weapons?
The Chinese will be very worried about and very concerned about United States and DPRK, whatever developments is there. They would want to have their fingers in it, because they do know that the DPRK is a strategic asset. And although it is some kind of an asset on their own, is not an asset they can control fully, is still an asset in the pockets of China. Having said that, if in the next 12 to 18 months we will see a peace dividend after Iran and after Ukraine, possibly, then the PRK issue will be cast in a new light, and there could be new openings about a dialogue between China and the United States on North Korea, and between North Korea and the United States. So I would say, let's wait 6 to 12 months, 18 months, and see what happens there.
Thank you, Francesco. Yeah. What a great discussion this was. Dr. Mansourov, Francesco Sisci, thank you so much. Outstanding comments. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mansourov, for your brilliant insights and helping move the Washington Brief forward. And Dr. Francesco Sisci, we can't thank you enough. We'll look forward to working together on future dialogues. I want to thank the president of the Washington Times, Chris Dolan, and the threat status team under Guy Taylor and Ben Wolfgang. They will be covering this program as they always do, and it goes worldwide because our team at the security team that we have is well respected around the world. And we thank you all. Wonderful program. Have a great week.
This webcast is pre-recorded.